Jimmy Fortune did not come to Nashville with glory. He arrived with a warm voice, a guitar, and years of rejection. Before becoming part of the Statler Brothers, his life was made of nights singing in small bars, demo tapes that no one answered, and the feeling of being forgotten inside his own dream. But when the final door finally opened, it did not come with welcome. It came with doubtful eyes, the pressure of inheritance, and the shadow of a legend still alive but fading day by day. On stage, Jimmy had to smile, had to sing as if he belonged there. Behind the curtain, he lived with fear. One wrong note could be enough to mark him as a failed replacement. Success came, but always with a quiet ache. Every round of applause was a reminder that someone else had to step away for him to stand there. Jimmy Fortune's story is not only a journey from obscurity to the spotlight, it is a story about carrying gratitude for the past, bearing the loss of others, and learning to keep singing when pain itself becomes a part of glory that can no longer be separated. Jimmy Fortune was born on March 11, 1955, in Nelson County, Virginia, a rural area nestled among the Blue Ridge Mountains. His family belonged to the working class. His parents worked steadily, and money was never abundant. The rhythm of life at home revolved around daytime work and church on weekends. Discipline was not often spoken about. It was practiced, showing up to work on time, attending services regularly, keeping one's word within the community. Church was where Fortune first stood, in a choir. Not as a performer, but as one voice among many. Someone led the tempo. Someone held the harmony. Someone corrected when pitch slipped. Rehearsals were regular. Fortune learned how to place his breath, hold his key, and not overpower others. For a boy, the lesson was not only technical. It was about learning how to occupy the right place within a structure. Music also sounded through daily life. The radio at home played familiar voices: Hank Williams, the Louvin Brothers, recordings of the Statler Brothers. No one called it influence. It was simply what was heard. Fortune absorbed song structure, how harmonies were arranged, and how a high tenor could lift a blend without stepping forward. There was no extra money set aside for music, no formal lessons, no private rehearsal room. Fortune sang whenever there was opportunity, in church, at community gatherings, at local events. Some days he had to choose between extra work and staying to rehearse. Those small decisions created very real limits. His voice was trained under imperfect conditions, but quitting was never an option. At Nelson County High School in Lovingston, Fortune continued singing in familiar spaces. His high, smooth tenor began to be mentioned, not on paper, but by word of mouth. Holds his pitch. Solid in harmony. Short phrases, but enough to build trust within the community. What shaped this period most was not talent, but habit. Singing was not seen as a way out. It was simply part of life. That Fortune learned to maintain his voice while still keeping pace with family responsibilities and work. That habit would follow him into larger spaces, where singing would no longer be a communal activity, but a profession demanding harsher conditions. Moving into the 1970s, Jimmy Fortune began stepping beyond church settings, performing more at local venues. In winter, he booked shows at ski resorts in Virginia. Stages stood close to bar counters, lighting was low, wet boots scraped across wooden floors. Opening lines were often swallowed by conversation and laughter. Fortune had to wait until the chorus, pushing his voice higher than usual to keep the room engaged. A single set lasted 3 to 4 hours. One song followed another, with no real break. By the end of the night, his throat burned dry, his breath uneven. One late winter evening, reaching for a familiar high note, his voice slipped. Fortune shifted key on stage, avoiding the high passage and bringing the song safely to its end. When he stepped down, the manager looked at him for a moment and said, Next week you sing less. We'll let someone else take part of the set." The next morning, Fortune woke early. On the kitchen table sat an unpaid rent bill beside a small notebook where several show dates had been crossed out. He tested his voice in the kitchen, just one short phrase. The sound came out rough. No one in the house said anything. Breakfast moved quickly, the silence stretching longer than usual. And the car outside still waited for the night's drive, but the schedule had already thinned by one evening. The years that followed moved in a tightened rhythm. Peak seasons came earlier and lasted longer. Some weeks, Fortune sang 6 nights straight, driving dozens of miles each evening. Mornings, he rose before everyone else, staying quiet to conserve his voice. Once, arriving home near dawn, he overslept and missed a family gathering. No one blamed him. The silence simply took its place. In the late 1970s, the performance schedule began to waver. A few familiar venues replaced him with younger singers. Some nights, Fortune arrived early and stood backstage, listening to someone else run sound on the very stage he had worked for years. The manager explained briefly, "They need a stronger voice this season." After that show, Fortune sat in his car for a long time, not starting the engine. During that period, at a local performance, a music professional from outside the region stayed to hear the entire set. Afterward, he asked Fortune about his tenor voice, whether he had ever considered going further, joining a group that needed a steady high harmony to fill an opening. The conversation was quick, without promises. Before leaving, the man left contact information and said simply, "If things change, I call." The late-night drives continued. Same roads, same venues, same hours. But each morning, standing in the kitchen testing his voice longer than usual, Fortune began to feel clearly that the limits of this rhythm were no longer distant. One evening, he sat in his car a few minutes after turning off the engine, looking at the schedule book on the passenger seat, where crossed-out lines appeared more often. The old pattern still ran. But for the first time, another possibility had a real address to return to. And Fortune understood that either he endured until his voice could no longer meet the bookings, or he stepped out of the familiar circle, not knowing where he would stand. Winter 1981, at a ski resort in Virginia, Jimmy Fortune stepped onto his usual stage as he had hundreds of nights before. The lights were low, the room loud, the set unfolding in its controlled rhythm. Among those listening that night was Lou DeWitt, the original tenor of the Statler Brothers. Lou had not come to find a replacement. He came as a chance listener, carrying a body already turning against him because of Crohn's disease. Lou stayed for the full show. He did not look for fireworks. He did not need showmanship. What kept him there was how Fortune sustained his voice through each song, not pushing beyond limits, not losing pitch as the set stretched on. Afterward, Lou introduced himself briefly, asked about range, asked about short-term touring availability. The exchange did not resemble a promise. It felt like a test laid quietly on the table. Early in 1982, Jimmy Fortune was invited to audition for the Statler Brothers. No big stage, no welcoming ritual. He stood in a rehearsal room, singing parts Lou had carried for years, songs tied to the audience's memory. Fortune kept the structure, kept the spirit, avoided anything that might seem like showing off. After the audition, little was said. A tour schedule was handed over. Fortune began appearing with the group as a temporary substitute. In those early months, Fortune stepped onto Statler stages in a place that was not his. He stood where Lou had stood, sang the notes Lou had held. Audiences watched him with comparison more than expectation. Fortune did not introduce himself, did not tell his story. He arrived, did the assigned part, then stepped back. Each night was a walk along a thin line between presence and intrusion. Backstage, Fortune observed how the group functioned. Song entries, pauses, small signals needing no words. The Statler's legacy lived in every detail. Fortune understood his role was not to refresh the group, but to keep its structure standing while a vital link weakened. By late 1982, when Lou DeWitt's health no longer allowed touring, the decision came in a brief backstage conversation. No large meeting, no ceremony of transition. One member said simply, "We need you to stay." Fortune nodded. No speech. Just a step from substitute into a place held longer than expected. From then on, the pressure was not proving he deserved it, but not disturbing what already existed. Fortune kept his voice within the established frame, kept his stance, kept his distance from the center of the story. Each show became a quiet test. How to be present enough, yet not so present that he altered the audience's memory of the man who had stood there before. In that space, Fortune began to understand a very specific cost. The more he blended into the legacy, the more easily his own name could disappear beneath it. He had a position, a stage, a national schedule. But from here, most of his presence would be tied to sustaining history, rather than creating one bearing his own name. In the first years after becoming an official member, Jimmy Fortune was not seen as someone who had come to change the Statler Brothers. His unspoken task was to keep the group from drifting while an iconic voice had just left the lineup. That created a particular kind of silence. Fortune was present on stage every night, yet that presence was not meant to become the story. It was within that silence that songwriting began to open as another path. Elizabeth emerged in 1983 not to bring Fortune into the spotlight, but to fill an emotional space in the Statler's catalog. The song was written from a very private place, a love ballad without dramatic peaks, without vocal showmanship, placing feeling in endurance rather than intensity. When it reached #1 on the Billboard Country chart, Fortune did not step forward as a featured writer. On stage, the song was performed like any other Statler's piece, folded into a harmony system that had existed long before him. The shift happened backstage. Fortune was listened to more in rehearsal rooms, not because of chart success, but because he proved something rare. He could write new songs without making the audience feel they were hearing a different band. My Only Love in 1984 and Too Much on My Heart in 1985 continued that structure. Slow melodies, restrained lyrics, emotion placed lower than storytelling. Both reached #1, yet neither altered Fortune's physical place on stage. Within the group, this was not accidental. Fortune understood clearly that any excess could disturb the balance the Statlers had built over decades. He wrote as if adding another brick to an old wall, not trying to sign his name on it. His role became a kind of emotional pillar, keeping the tenor from overpowering, keeping the harmonies from leaning, and keeping the band's narrative seamless through a sensitive transition. In 1989, More Than a Name on a Wall marked another boundary in Fortune's writing trajectory. It was not crafted for radio. The melody was slow, the structure restrained, the lyrics avoided climax. The focus rested on names etched into memorial stone, people existing only through the memory of those left behind. When the song reached the top 10, its life quickly separated from chart cycles. It was frequently requested at memorial services and veterans events. The atmosphere in rooms shifted noticeably when it was sung. Conversations stopped. There was no applause mid-song. After the final line, a short silence often came before clapping began. In those spaces, stage lighting was no longer central. Listeners did not come to watch a band. They came to remember. More than a name on a wall, moved beyond being a hit and became part of community ritual, where music carried the responsibility of naming loss. Fortune did not promote it as a personal statement. He allowed the song to enter those spaces on its own. From that point, his writing role opened into another dimension. Not only writing to entertain, but writing so music could stand in moments where charts had no meaning. During the same period, the Statler Brothers entered a state of achievement that had become routine. Repeated CMA and ACM Vocal Group of the Year awards, albums going gold, platinum, multi-platinum. On award stages, Fortune stood in formation, holding his part. His presence was tied to the group's overall stability year after year, to the lineup maintaining its shape and familiar sound before audiences. What stood out was not the number of #1 songs, but how Fortune placed himself behind the songwriting structure. He wrote songs strong enough to lift the band and integrated enough not to alter the Statlers' established form. In that position, his music did not rise as a separate signature. It became part of the collective sound, where the boundary between writer and group identity gradually blurred. His value was felt in the seamlessness of the whole, in audiences hearing the Statlers before hearing any individual. When the Statler Brothers show began airing on TNN in 1991, the group entered another state of fame. They were no longer only a successful touring country act, but a recurring television brand, appearing weekly in millions of American living rooms. The 7 consecutive seasons did more than create familiarity. They created a sense of safety, faces unchanged, voices already memorized, an entertainment rhythm middle-aged audiences could trust. For Jimmy Fortune, this was the period when his presence reached its highest level of stability, and when his individual identity dissolved most deeply into the collective structure. On television, there was no space for personal breakthrough. Each member stood in roles shaped over decades. Don Reed as central narrator, Harold Reed as comedic pillar and base, Phil Balsley as steady foundation, and Jimmy as, from the beginning, the one who held balance. He was not brought in to redefine the Statlers, but to extend the life of an already completed legacy. Television, with its repetition and tight control, reinforced that role. Each taped episode was a precise equation of timing, harmony, script. There was no room for nights off rhythm, for singing beyond structure. Jimmy sang correctly, stood correctly, appeared at the right moment, and exited the frame at the right time. Taping days often began early. Dressing rooms opened hours before filming. Rehearsal schedules were posted on walls. Each segment had fixed duration to the minute. When the red light came on, deviation had no place. A passage lasting a few seconds too long could disrupt the entire program structure. Jimmy learned to sing not only in pitch, but in time, to keep his voice within the camera frame, and to finish on the director's cue. Television turned music into a sequence of precise operations, where stability outweighed personal expression. Performances at the White House during the administrations of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush marked a symbolic peak. The Statlers represented a traditional America: family, military, collective memory, moral steadiness. Jimmy stood on those stages not as an honored individual, but as part of a carefully framed national image. A great honor, yet also a form of elevated anonymity. At those events, positions were pre-assigned, space tightly controlled, no flexibility as on tour. Jimmy stood in formation as on television. Correct position, correct lighting, correct distance. After the programs, there was no sense of career peak in a personal sense. Only the feeling of having fulfilled a role within a ceremony larger than himself. Alongside television ran a dense touring schedule, operated like a finely tuned machine. Large venues, controlled sound, loyal audiences. Each night, Jimmy repeated songs that had become part of other people's memories. The paradox was clear. He had written some of the most emotionally resonant songs of the later Statler's era, yet on the public stage, they no longer belonged to him. As Elizabeth, My Only Love, Too Much on My Heart, More Than a Name on a Wall, all had been collectivized, dissolved into the shared brand. For nearly a decade, there was no visible crisis, no scandal, no collapse. Yet precisely for that reason, the emotional curve flattened. Jimmy was not struggling to survive. He was inside a state many artists dream of, protected by a successful structure. The issue was that the structure no longer required him to grow beyond it. In the final years before retirement, the calendar remained full, but life moved with more mechanics than feeling. Familiar songs repeated in the same order. Dressing rooms became so familiar, they lost the sense of beginning. Jimmy began to recognize he was existing inside a completed system, one with little room to become someone else. When the Statler Brothers announced retirement in 2002, the decision reached the public as a graceful ending. For Jimmy Fortune, it was a quiet but thorough separation. After 21 years, he stepped away from a brand his identity had fused with so completely that boundaries blurred. He did not lose the group. He lost the frame that held him. There was no immediate solo explosion, no debut album drawing sudden attention. This was not from lack of ability, but because Jimmy stepped out of the Statlers in a state very different from the image audiences often expect. Not a suppressed star, but someone long accustomed to not standing alone. The question of identity became concrete. How to exist outside the collective when his entire mature career had been built on blending with others. No four-part harmony to mask the silences. And no brand large enough to absorb fluctuations. Every choice afterward, music, faith, the solo path, had to be made without a safety net. Looking back, the television and mainstream era of the Statlers was not decline. It was the final peak of stability. That stability made the 2002 departure especially heavy, not because of lost fame, but because for the first time in 2 decades, Jimmy Fortune had to ask who he was when no longer standing in the formation that had shaped his life. After 2002, Jimmy Fortune left the Statlers without a memorable farewell moment. No launch tour, no repositioning campaign. His first performances took place in local churches and small halls of a few hundred seats, where schedules were handwritten on bulletin boards and pay covered little more than travel costs. There was no sense of return, only a new rhythm forming, slower, less protected, forcing the singer to face each room directly. Recording in 2003 happened under similar conditions. Small band, fewer harmonies, minimal editing. The voice was placed directly at the center of the recording, keeping breaths and thinner tones. After more than 20 years supported by layered harmony, Fortune had to fill space with his own breath. When one door closes was not thickened or polished, but kept close to the small stage experience, one person standing before a room with no layers behind. By the mid-2000s, a network of church performances began to stabilize. The schedule formed a familiar pattern. One state on weekends, another midweek. Simple sound, handheld microphone, speakers set near pulpits. Pitch often had to be adjusted live for each room. Many songs were tested directly before communities, then revised afterward. I Believe emerged within that cycle, not as a market release, but as part of regular life. Around 2008 to 2009, the calendar grew denser, but venues did not expand. Jimmy often traveled alone, finished late, drove at night, slept in roadside motels. Songwriting space narrowed, turning inward between performances. Songs were not written for specific rooms, but for the hours after stage lights went dark. Windows carried that rhythm. slow, spacious, allowing fatigue to exist in the voice without disguise. In the early 2000s, a clear request came from gospel audiences. They wanted to bring performances home, not just sound, but the atmosphere of live presence. Hits and Hymns was recorded directly in familiar performance spaces, cameras at the back of the room, lighting left as it was during real shows. Jimmy stood where he stood each night, led hymns, paused mid-song to shift keys. Silences remained. Commercial success came through church networks and direct sales after shows, not mainstream media. Around 2018 to 2019, Jimmy Fortune's music began to be called into ceremonial spaces, memorials, community events, gatherings, where music was no longer pure entertainment. God and country emerged in that context. Many performances took place not in theaters, but in community halls and large churches, where music stood beside ritual. Recognition from the gospel community felt less like a turn and more like confirmation of a role already formed. After nearly 2 decades standing alone, returning to a group model with Brothers of the Heart in 2020 carried a very different professional meaning. The collective structure was no longer a place where identity dissolved, but a consciously chosen space. In the new lineup, Jimmy held the tenor as a technical pillar. Clear harmony divisions, defined placement, role determined by function rather than display. Standing in a group became a professional choice, not habit. Jimmy Fortune's performances now often unfold in small rooms with wooden chairs and fixed lights. Before shows, he stands at the platform, rechecks the key of a familiar hymn, asks to lower it half a step for the room. Only band members and a few technicians present. He begins singing, pauses to adjust breathing, then continues. When doors open and the audience enters, the show proceeds like many others. A tenor voice that has moved through many structures now stands inside one he has chosen himself. Not to make a statement, but to sustain a working rhythm that has become habit. If Jimmy Fortune's career was shaped by stepping into and then out of large structures, his private life moved to a different rhythm, early, fast, with little buffer. He married very young, in a rural setting where starting a family often came before a person had settled their sense of self. The roles of husband and father appeared alongside his still learning how to survive in music. Family responsibility did not come after his career. It arrived at the beginning, when nothing else was yet defined. The early years of family life were tied to concrete realities: rent, daily expenses, and trips to find singing opportunities wherever they existed. Music was not only passion, it became the only means of maintaining a household. As bookings increased, absence became part of daily life. Longer trips, shorter returns, meals with someone missing. There was no single crisis to name, only the rhythm of the stage slowly drifting away from the rhythm of home. His first marriage ended not in an explosion, but in the gradual withdrawal of 2 people accustomed to living in different orbits. Fortune continued with music, not as an act of liberation, but as the only path he knew how to hold on to. The ending did not bring relief. It left a long stretch of emptiness where family had once been an anchor but was no longer there to return to. For many years afterward, emotional life did not occupy the center. As his career with the Statler Brothers entered its stable phase, the dense schedule and collective structure filled most of daily living. Family existed as background, important, but without enough space to become the axis of life. Only after stepping away from the Statlers, when professional pace slowed and choices were no longer predetermined, did Fortune have the conditions to rebuild private life at his own tempo. His marriage to Nina Fortune formed in a very different context. No rush of youth, no pressure to chase an imposed schedule. Nina entered a life already accustomed to long absences and extended performances, and chose to remain within that rhythm. The relationship was not built on promises to change careers, but on accepting reality. Music would remain, but it would no longer be the sole force defining family life. At this stage, family began to hold a more concrete place in daily living. Small gatherings, time not tied to performance calendars, moments that did not require preparation to step onto a stage. After decades of constant movement, being still within family space did not mean rest. It meant stability, something rare in his early years. In February 2023, signs could no longer be ignored. Fortune began to feel short of breath climbing a few steps, heaviness in his chest after long performances, fatigue that did not fade after a night's sleep. A cardiac check led to deeper tests. Results showed multiple severe coronary blockages. The recommendation came quickly: quintuple bypass surgery. The operation unfolded not in the language of the stage, but in the rhythm of the operating room and intensive care. After surgery, Fortune spent initial days in ICU for heart rhythm, blood pressure, and medication monitoring. When moved to a regular room, very small actions became milestones. Sitting up for the first time, walking a few steps down the hallway, breathing exercises with assisted devices to fully reopen the lungs. Each step measured by heart rate and exhaustion, not by the endurance habits that had followed him for years. Recovery stretched over weeks. Heart medications, blood thinners, frequent follow-ups. Movement had to slow. Sleep had to be regulated. Things once routine, standing long on stage, singing many songs in sequence, driving long distances at night, now had to be weighed as thresholds of tolerance. The body was no longer an instrument of endless expenditure. It became the center of every decision. When he returned to performing, Fortune did not resume by old momentum. Set lengths were shortened. Songs demanding sustained endurance were no longer placed back-to-back. Extended high passages were carefully selected. On stage, the most visible change lay in breathing. Longer holds between lines, pauses left undisturbed rather than filled. Not because he could no longer sing, but because each performance now had to remain within limits his body allowed. Late in 2024, the family faced a cut with no time to prepare. His son, Jimmy Jr., died suddenly from pneumonia. There was no long hospital vigil, no gradual adjustment to the possibility of loss. A phone call, then the immediate tasks that follow. Practical things no family rehearses. Afterward, changes did not arrive through grand statements, but through small details at home. A phone number no longer lighting the screen. A familiar dinner chair empty. A habit of brief texts before shows gone. These did not create dramatic peaks, but repeated daily, enough to make clear that a part of life had withdrawn and would not return. Standing on stage afterward carried a different rhythm. No song dedicated to loss. No memorial program. Yet moments when he stood still longer before the first line, and as if waiting for a familiar signal that no longer came. Some nights he chose songs less demanding, with more breathing space, not to display emotion, but to complete the performance without being carried away by it. In private life, grief did not become a narrative. It lived in quieter evenings, in Nina clearing the table and leaving a space without comment, in family occasions where a name was no longer called by habit. There is no way to schedule such things. They require no explanation. They simply remain steady in very small acts. Fortune did not bring this pain before the public as a new role. No memorial album, no themed tour. He continued appearing in familiar spaces, churches, small halls, community events. There, music was not used to tell the story of loss. It was simply the only way he knew to stand in a room, raise his voice, and keep life's rhythm moving, while a part of private life was gone. Fortune does not stand at an end point. He exists in a state permanently altered. Family is no longer only a center. It is what keeps what remains from collapsing. Music is still present, but it no longer covers the whole of life. And pain is not closed. It is carried, not as a story that needs finishing, but as something that will continue beside him, quietly, in each pause between songs. The honors given to Jimmy Fortune have taken place in a subdued atmosphere, as with little drama, consistent with the way he has existed in music. In 2007, when the Statler Brothers were inducted into the GMA Gospel Music Hall of Fame, Fortune stood on stage with the remaining members in a hall familiar to gospel audiences. Warm lighting, a choir behind them, introductions focused on the collective journey rather than individuals. He stepped forward, accepted the plaque, bowed his head in brief thanks. No solo speech. No moment of being separated from the formation. In 2008, at the Country Music Hall of Fame, the setting was more formal, the stage larger, the language of recognition more overtly historical. The Statlers were presented as an essential part of the traditional country era. Jimmy Fortune again stood within that line, in the place audiences knew. He was not named as someone who changed the story, but as the one who helped the story continue after Lou DeWitt left. Two honors, two different settings, yet the same posture. Fully present, without emphasis on himself. A clear difference appeared only in 2018, when Jimmy Fortune was inducted into the Virginia Musical Hall of Fame as a solo figure. This was the first time his name was spoken without the Statlers attached. At the podium, the story did not begin with CMA or ACM awards, but with place, Nelson County, small churches, a local singing before any major contract. Fortune stood alone, receiving the honor. No lineup to blend into, no collective structure to share the weight of the moment. The event was not large in national scale, but it carried a distinct separation. For the first time, his personal path was recognized as its own line, not simply an extension of a collective legend. The most symbolic moment came in 2023, when a bronze statue of Jimmy Fortune was erected in Nelson County, Virginia. The statue stands outdoors, nearly life-sized, not placed on a high pedestal. Fortune is depicted standing upright, hands relaxed at his sides. No microphone, no stage lighting. The unveiling took place among the local community, people who had heard him sing in church and at small events before his name was linked with the Statlers. The setting felt less like a national ceremony and more like a rural gathering. Short remarks, modest applause, a familiar atmosphere rather than formal grandeur. The statue does not commemorate a single peak moment. It acknowledges a sustained presence. Fortune is not portrayed as a star in mid-performance, but as someone who belonged to this place from the beginning, left, and returned without changing form. Looking at this sequence of recognitions, a clear paradox emerges. Jimmy Fortune was acknowledged late and is largely remembered not for standing at the front, but for standing firm for a long time. He did not enter history through a dramatic turn. He exists in history through steadiness, through accepting roles that did not draw attention, and through the ability to remain when surrounding structures changed. These honors do not turn Fortune into an icon to be magnified. They mark a path completed. From a church voice in Nelson County, through major stages with the Statlers, then back to that same ground in the form of someone who traveled far but never left his roots. He is not remembered for occupying the center, but for keeping many other centers from collapsing. After that cycle of recognition closed, the rhythm of life shifted as well. Music remained, but no longer filled the calendar as a default. Trips no longer lined up into long chains of months. Travel became a deliberate choice, not a constant state. The road stopped being a temporary home. It returned to its proper role, a link between carefully chosen points, where each departure and return was considered rather than driven by touring momentum. Performance spaces narrowed naturally. Churches, small halls, community auditoriums, places where a voice could fill the room without massive sound systems. Fortune often arrives early, stands on the empty stage, sings a few lines, changes key if the ceiling is low or the room absorbs sound. There is no fixed set list. Each night adjusts to the room, the day's voice, the atmosphere of those seated below. This flexibility is not for surprise, but for balance, where the voice does not strain to claim the space, but is allowed to merge with it. Recording continues, but not in dense production cycles. Projects form from specific needs. A hymn group sung repeatedly in live settings, a song frequently requested by communities, or a theme that needs to be documented for long-term use. The studio is no longer a place to create product, but to preserve songs that have lived long enough on stage. Recordings do not stand above the live experience. They exist alongside it, as a way to hold what has already been tested in real space. Faith remains the underlying structure of this rhythm, but without performance value. Church is not only a place to sing, but for regular life, prayer gatherings, community meetings, time not tied to music. Faith does not need to be emphasized as a theme. It is present as a familiar rhythm, steady enough not to require constant naming. The slower pace does not reduce workload, but changes how energy is distributed. Invitations are chosen based on stamina, distance, and the ability to keep each performance within a rhythm that can be sustained long-term. The clearest change is not in the quality of the voice, but in how Fortune holds silence. Between songs, between lines, between stretches of travel, silence becomes part of the structure, creating space for the voice to sit properly rather than be pushed past limits. Within this rhythm, music stands beside other pillars of life. It remains central labor, but within a more balanced structure where family, health, and daily living share the tempo. Choice, once rare during years of dense touring, now shapes how he continues to appear. Jimmy Fortune is remembered through a sustained form of presence, enduring, steady, firm enough to hold the overall rhythm. His mark lies in the distance traveled, in the ability to maintain a voice over time, more than in any single burst of brilliance. His path has been guided by loyalty to the structures that nurtured him, faith as an inner axis, the voice as daily work, and values maintained through consistent presence. His career thus moves like a continuous flow, each stage connected to the last through habit, discipline, and the capacity to remain within chosen structures. In the wider landscape of music, Jimmy Fortune exists as a voice that keeps time. He does not need to be at the center to have impact. His presence is felt most clearly in the durability of the whole, in how a structure continues standing over time, supported by those who choose to stand in their place.